But he convinced me to go into the field because I wanted to study art at the Art Institute of Chicago, but art doesn't pay the mortgage. Art doesn't pay the mortgage, young lady.
Art 101 with Mr. Burgher.
Scholars, welcome back to Art 101 with me, Mr. Burgher. I'm a professional artist and master educator attempting to provide you with the best in art historical content. If you like it, follow along. Much appreciate that.
I don't want to hear this shit while I'm eating.
So today, in this one, as you know, just clicked on the video, we're going to be jumping into the Harlem Renaissance. We've touched on it periodically over the years and whatnot, but today we're going to dive right in and cover some of the major artists and kind of what the whole Harlem Renaissance was about. So let's just jump right into it. Harlem is a New York City neighborhood that in the early 20th century developed into a black cultural mecca that would grow strong for nearly 30 years. Now, this all began with black migration to the north from the south, and I've touched on that before in my piece about black migration with the Jacob Lawrence series of works, but to kind of sum it up, basically, blacks were moving from the south to the north to obtain jobs, to get better education, for housing, and especially to escape Jim Crow laws that kept them from being able to really succeed in life. So anyway, New York was one of the major destinations as these folks migrated north. Now, Harlem was formerly an upper middle class type neighborhood in New York City prior to this. Buildings were left empty, and so they became filled with black tenants because there was a huge labor shortage during World War I. Again, folks that were migrating from the South. They were working in the factories. They stepped up to fit a need that was beneficial for everybody. Anyway, within this neighborhood, they developed a culture, they developed an identity, and this thinking really became the roots of what would become the Harlem Renaissance. You see actors, we see dancing, writers, and artists of all stripes making their mark on the Harlem Renaissance. And we see individuals like Langston Hughes as a literary genius coming out of this movement. We see the unbelievable performing artistry of individuals like Duke Ellington and so many others. But this is really to focus on the visual arts, so that's kind of where my focus is going to be.
Forget about the way it used to be. This is not a damn democracy. We are in a state of emergency, and my word is law.
I think first and foremost, we got to start at the top with Aaron Douglas. Now, Mr. Douglas was the most celebrated of the visual artists at this time. No matter what type of visual art we're talking about, visual art at that time was a white male-dominated occupation. And so art schools, art galleries, art museums weren't very welcome to any sort of diversity to that. And Aaron Douglas was pretty smart about how he broke in. He became a critic first, using his writing skills and language to break into the visual arts. Kind of a backdoor method if you want to know the truth. At any rate, he started out as a landscape painter and then began to transition a little bit into cubism and graphic arts. And he kind of became a fatherly leading figure in the black art movement moving forward, right up to the end of the prosperous time of the Harlem Renaissance.
A VIP moment.
Another artist, Archibald Motley, was among the first to go to art school at the Art Institute of Chicago and actually created artworks that illustrated the riches of the black folks at that time that were beginning to prosper in this neighborhood, in this Harlem Renaissance time. And he did this with a very wide range of styles. He was very chameleon-like in that regard. Side note, although Archibald is synonymous with the Harlem Renaissance, he actually never lived in Harlem at all.
Good morning, my neighbors! Hey, you!
Now, we've talked about several of these artists before, and one that I've touched on and that you might want to check out is Augusta Savage. a sculptor who created all kinds of small plaster and clay works that focused on African American content. She was also very encouraging for other blacks to join the Federal Arts Project that was working as a division of the Work Progress Administration, giving individuals work during the Great Depression. And her skills did not just end at being a fine artist, she was also a very finely tuned art educator, teaching individuals like Jacob Lawrence, Norman Lewis, and Gwendolyn Knight.
No, I don't see students outside of school. It's just a little rule of mine.
Hale Woodruff was a very knowledgeable artist who studied at Harvard, he studied in Chicago, and even went across to Paris to learn the modern art styles from the Parisians and brought that back to Harlem. And he was also very much influenced by the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, who he worked with and influenced his awareness of social justice types of themes in his artwork, and that it really much influenced the artwork that he produced and influenced others around him.
Classic.
Seeing the actual structure of Harlem at work through photographs, that was the work of James Van Der Zee. He worked on the streets and was given commissioned portraits in his studio, becoming the unofficial chronicler of life in Harlem at that time. His photographs really become a record of what times were like, what life was like, what it was like to be on the streets for rallies and get-togethers and the people and all of those sorts of things in that neighborhood.
My neighborhood has gone through so much. It's gone through something called gentrification. Can you say gentrification, boys and girls?
Now, as I mentioned, there were singers, actors, all sorts of artists that were at work, but this did not end with just black men that wanted to make gains during the Harlem Renaissance. The black community recognized that women were being very much marginalized and minimized, so they were very much at the forefront of what the Harlem Renaissance was about. Many women actually came out of this movement, including Meta Warrick Fuller, Lois Jones, Selma Burke, Laura Waring, and Alice Catlett.
Yes, sir. Behind every good man, there's a woman, and she usually catches him, too.
The Harlem Renaissance really had an awesome thing going within their community, and here's what caused it to fail. The first blemish on the Harlem Renaissance was the stock market crash of 1929. After this happens, people stop spending money, our country goes into a Great Depression, and that causes hardships all the way around. Now, during this time, the United States is also under a prohibition. It was illegal for individuals to purchase alcohol. So one of the few ways to get alcohol was to go to these underground types of bars called speakeasies. And in Harlem, it was kind of cool. They had several of these places that you could go and nobody seemed to bother them. And so people were coming into the city of Harlem to patronize their speakeasies. But when Prohibition was lifted in 1933, they didn't have to go to Harlem anymore. And they could go to their local neighborhood bars to get their alcohol or wherever. And so they didn't have to go to Harlem. And that stopped money from coming into the city. And the last unfortunate blow to the Harlem Renaissance was a race riot that took place in 1935. This resulted in 3 people being killed, hundreds of people being injured, and millions of dollars in damage. And when that happened, people saw Harlem as a dangerous place to go. People stopped going to spend their money. They stopped patronizing the people that had their businesses there. And so people left. They wanted to go other places that were more safe and that sort of thing.
Oh, okay, so you hard now.
Now, despite the downfall, I think it's important for us to recognize the importance of the Harlem Renaissance, what a community was able to do despite being given limited opportunities. They kind of made their own fortune. They made their own future. They weren't going to take no for an answer, and they really changed people's minds about their artistry and the things that they were doing. I mean, this was a major time for artists, writers, musicians, and the ideas that they would project into their community would really set the future up for the civil rights movement that was to come just a few decades down the road. So once that first domino of thought fell, the community would continue that way, way beyond the Harlem Renaissance and the time that it was really, really in fashion. And so that is something that we can really be proud of these folks for accomplishing. Thanks for watching that to the end. And remember, if you're in the market for some t-shirts and whatnot, support Art 101 by going to redbubble.com, and you can see some cool tees like this one, What Do I Know, I Color for a Living, and lots and lots of other things. So, you can check it out. Anyway, I appreciate you watching this one on the Harlem Renaissance, and see you next time.
You're really smart about stuff. Like, you know a lot of things.
Thanks.
I was thinking you can maybe have like your own talk show or something.